All right, let's pick up from the last video. In this table here, we're comparing and contrasting the Asian versus the European models. And this is late 1980s data, which would have been the peak of Japanese performance. Remember, the 90s represented a lost decade that has carried through to more recent times with very lackluster growth. It would more represent the beginning of the first world kind of status of these countries here, the Asian tigers. Remember, they were growing quite a bit after World War II into the 60s and 70s, but it really was in the 80s when they took off and started to witness the kind of growth that brings about a first world standard of living. But for the most part, what I want to do is focus on the distinction between Europe in general and these countries. And first off, notice GDP per capita. Now, this is in 93 prices, but notice that Europe and Japan are more or less similar, with these other countries much less, Korea and Taiwan being quite low. But they were sowing the seeds of improvement. For example, this is the gross domestic investment over gross GDP, which gives us effectively the fraction of GDP that is invested in the economy. Now, remember, investment includes, capital formation, buildings, equipment, the kind of infrastructure that businesses use to produce. So greater investment is going to lead to greater productivity and ultimately more growth. And then the next one is gross savings. Now, what I want to highlight between these two is, first off, Europe, it's about the same, which means it's gross savings as a percent of GDP is what's being invested in the economy. Another way of putting that is they're saving 1/5 of their economy, and they're investing 1/5 of their economy. So all of that savings they generate is flowing into their own system. But look at Japan. In the late 80s, Japan was actually saving a little more than they're investing domestically. So that extra 1% there is going to be able to flow to other countries as foreign direct investment and start to help those economies. What's most notable here is the Asian tigers. Look at the discrepancy between these numbers. 35 versus 27% in Hong Kong, 43 versus 35 in Singapore, 37 and 35 in South Korea, and 32 and 27 in Taiwan. In every single case, the gross savings as a fraction of GDP is greater than the gross domestic investment, which means they have extra savings that can flow to other countries and represent foreign direct investment. Now, why is this important? Because when countries have savings in excess of their investment, that money flows out. It fertilizes the ground for other countries to grow. I mean, we know that a lot of poor countries rely on foreign investment in order to get that leg up. In other words, their own people can't necessarily save a lot of money, so they rely on foreigners, richer countries, to do that. That's exactly what these Asian tigers are doing in the late 80s. And where is that money going? Well, a lot of it's going to poorer countries. It's going to the mini dragons. And with that flow of savings also comes a flow of the Asian model ideals, right? We said before, it's not just goods that flows, it's ideas that flow. So these countries are going to be in a position to kind of lead the next generation of up and coming capitalist countries. Now, you'll notice Japan was barely above its gross domestic investment, 1%. But that's because Japan had already done that. Remember, back after World War II, Japan was similar to these Asian tigers. They were experiencing a gross savings rate much greater than their investment rate. And that flowed to these Asian tigers. Again, think about it's like ripples in a pond, you get the flow of ideas from Japan to the Asian tigers after World War II. And then you get the flow of ideas from the Asian tigers to the mini dragons, and the model itself, the Asian model, expands across a larger array of nations. Notice also literacy. Literacy is very high, 100% in Europe and Japan in the 80s, and it's lower in these countries, but believe it or not, these are high numbers, especially compared to their per capita GDP. When you see low numbers like this in GDP, you usually don't see these kinds of literacy rates, which implies that they're putting a premium on literacy. Not only are these Asian tigers pushing capital formation and saving high percentages, and again, some of it flowing to other countries, but they're also putting a premium on human capital, not just physical capital, but human capital, another important catalyst for growth. And then, the people per doctor, that's an important one, kind of shows that there's a decent number of doctors for people. And that's important because you can't have a healthy labor force if you don't have health care. And then government revenue as a fraction of GDP. This is a good way of assessing the size of government. Notice it's 40% in Europe and 29% in Japan, much lower in these other countries. And that's a catalyst for growth because with a smaller government comes a smaller tax burden, and that incentivizes more capital formation, more savings, and overall more productivity. All right, let's keep going. Asian corporate governance. In the Asian model, we're going to see some parallels to the European model. There is going to be more priority on the stakeholder than the shareholder. But in many ways, it's for different reasons. In the Asian model, we'll see that the stakeholder is perceived more as a family member. The worker is like part of the corporate family. So they're a stakeholder, but it's much more of a paternalistic kind of environment than what you would see in Europe, where the stakeholder, they're part of the company. They're perceived as being maybe more important than the shareholders, but there isn't that paternalistic attitude of, they're the children of the larger company, part of a bigger family. There's a couple of terms here that we want to know: the zabatsus and the kuritsus. The zabatsus were a vertical and horizontal conglomerate structure that dominated Japan prior to World War II. Now recall that Japan lost the war in 1945 and effectively became a very different country after that. It became a democracy, symbolic emperor, but for the most part a constitutional democracy. But there was this element of monopolization and oligopolization that had existed for decades in Japan. And it was, related to the cultural aspects and just practical business. You're talking about a country that has been isolated for many, many decades, and in most respects by design. But that isolation forced them to be much more unified in their business management. In other words, it was more important to have a system that would integrate the banks with the business, and the business would be integrated with the stakeholders and the shareholders, and they would all be under this umbrella of government. And it was like one big family that would be considered the zaibatsu. Okay, this relationship between directors and banks and the whole corporate family was concerning because for the occupational forces at the end of the war, they saw this as the government having a lot of control over the means of production that could be used for weaponry and for world domination. So they wanted to break them up. And that's exactly what they did. The U.S. effectively, when we went in and rebuilt Japan as a constitutional democracy, we broke up the zaibatsus and made it illegal to do this kind of thing. These strong relationships were banned. Another way of putting it is we just infused competition into the environment. That doesn't mean that the whole thing dissolved. The culture is still there. The ideals are still there, but it morphed into what are known as the kuritsus. The kuritsus are, again, vertical and horizontal conglomerates which have a bank at the center, and the bank serves as like the source of all funding. It's like the heart, right, that pumps out the blood to the rest of the body. The bank pumps out the money to the rest of the organizations. And they emphasize growth of the conglomerate over profit maximization. So again, stakeholder versus shareholder interest. Profits may be subordinate to grow the larger company for the benefit of everybody. It is emulated in other Asian countries, grupos in some countries, but the most famous would be the Korean shaibos. Some of you may have heard of the Korean dramas, and this is whole media kind of entertainment that revolves around the family relationships of the big corporations in Korea. So it's not just, it's almost like the Kardashians in the US. You know, there's all this intrigue with these billion-dollar families that, you know, and the troubles that they experience. Well, there's dramas about the rich Korean families that run some of the biggest companies in that country, the Korean shaibos. State supports through guaranteed lines of credit to main bank, which ultimately supplies credit to the industrial group. So think of it like this. The state becomes a kind of a lender of last resort and a support system for the banks. And then the banks, they become a support system for the companies. And the companies are encircling the bank. And the companies, therefore, have these strong connections that are not full-out oligopolies or monopolies, but they definitely bring about some of the same results. There is an inefficiency from an economic standpoint that occurs here. Consumers pay higher prices, and it's very difficult to change these strong relationships because they're so intertwined at multiple levels in the country, government, you know, all the way down to the household level. Mitigates corporate takeovers, promotes longer-term decision-making, growth orientation, and insulates business from market fluctuations. These are the benefits, you know, the mitigating of corporate takeovers. If the companies are already connected and, you know, each company owns stock in each other company and the directors on one board sits on the directors of another and they're all around this common bank, then it's very hard for an outsider to come in and take over those companies. And again, that's a problem for stakeholder capitalism anyway, because the stakeholders hold the stock for reasons other than profit, which means they may not want to sell. They may hold it because the family holds it, because they're part of this large network, and that's what matters. Promotes longer-term decision-making, meaning it's not just about short-run profits. They may sacrifice profits in order to achieve growth over the long run. That gives them a higher growth orientation, and it does limit the effects of the business cycle on their productivity. In the U.S. Anglo model, we go into a recession, you get layoffs, you get cutbacks, you get corporate bankruptcies, and you get that push to try to keep profits high or minimize the downside for shareholders. You don't see that here. You know, when you go into a recession in many of these Asian countries, there isn't much of a change in terms of business. But no doubt the shareholders take a hit, and that's by design. Now, you'll notice a lot of this stuff is really related to creating an environment for growth. We learned in planned socialism that a socialist system can be much more effective than a capitalist system at actually creating an industrial revolution. Best examples are during wartime, right, where the government takes over the economy and just funnels resources towards the production of capital. But you don't have to have government do that. If you're not going to have government do that and you still want a growth orientation, an industrial revolution, then forming these kinds of vertical and horizontal conglomerates where effectively the capitalist system, the private businesses become like one big government. It becomes almost like one big planned socialist experiment, but not through democracy or dictatorship, but instead through capitalism. So it's no coincidence the Keiritsus continued after the Zaibatsus were banned. And even to this day, this Japanese style of business exists alongside the Korean shaibos and give distinction to the Asian model that otherwise wouldn't be there. All right, we'll stop there and move on to the next slide in the next video. Thanks. Let me know if you have questions.